Welcome to Pre-Shift, tidbits of wisdom for everyday service. My name is TJ Griffin, and I'm the corporate wine educator for Winebow. We encourage your questions at any point during the webinar, but please use the Q&A rather than the chat bar. Let me introduce your host. Master Sommelier Ron Edwards is the husband of one wife, the father of 5 girls, and a surfer and a missionary kid. He has almost 30 years of hospitality experience, and since 2018, he has been the director of wine education for Winebow. And now here to discuss today's topic, Pinot Blanc and Garnacha, Master Sommelier Ron Edwards.
Good morning, TJ. Good morning, everybody out there in the audience. Hope you've all had a lovely Labor Day weekend, and it's not too awful to come back to work today. It is a necessary part of our lives, I suppose, and honestly, it's a great blessing to be employed in most cases. TJ, how was your holiday?
It was very good. Thank you for asking.
Excellent. Well, today we're going to talk about a couple of grapes instead of all this deep thoughts with Jack Handy routine that I often do. And we're going to do what TJ and I tend to do most, which is talk about wine-related materials instead of service-related materials. So TJ, you ready to talk about Pinot Blanc and Garnacha?
I am ready.
Well, let's do it then. All right. And by the way, love the interactions. So please do jump in and send us questions in the Q&A if you have them, or just comments, either way. Pinot Blanc, a winding road. I really think this is an accurate kind of thought process when we talk about Pinot Blanc, because it's a bit of a struggle at times to put our finger on what is Pinot Blanc. TJ, is this something that you feel as well, that Pinot Blanc is a bit of a moving target?
Yeah, I thought I knew Pinot Blanc 20 years ago, and then I thought I knew it 10 years ago, and I'm still learning about it. It's a much more interesting grape than I think a lot of people give it credit for.
I agree with that. And I think part of the reason it's more interesting now and why we keep having to relearn it, TJ, is that people are putting more emphasis on it. Winemakers have decided that it's more interesting than maybe we gave it credit for, and are trying to elevate their end product kind of globally at this point. And the other thing I think we can turn to is sort of the anti-Chardonnay craze, for lack of a better description. I think it really boils down more to the crisp, unoaked white craze that has happened over the last 20 years that sort of became the 50-50, right? You either like the oaked whites, including Chardonnay, as a first preference, or you like the unoaked whites led by Pinot Grigio as the first preference. Do you think that has a lot to do with it too?
Yeah, I never thought about that, but that's definitely, I'm sure, a factor.
And as we as consumers express interest in varietals that maybe we haven't paid attention to until now, it certainly helps the wineries feel like they can pay attention to it as well. So there we have it. And Pinot Blanc has a luxury of having Pinot in the title, which is a familiar name that people are comfortable with, because we think of Pinot Gris, we think of Pinot Noir, we think of Pinot Grigio. So in that regard, it's a little friendly. The Blanc part gets a little weird for people. They don't really know, well, is this just another name for Pinot Gris? Is this something else? And, Pinot Blanc is its own thing. It is a descendant of Pinot Noir. It's a sister of Pinot Gris, a really, really close relative to Gouais Blanc, which we really don't see on labels. And no, Auxerrois out of Alsace is not the same grape, but it is a sister. They are in the same family. And in Alsace, Pinot Blanc and Auxerrois are blended together liberally and basically treated as the same grape, and can be labeled as Pinot Blanc with both grapes in there. So that's just something to be aware of. Yes, Pinot Blanc has a definable personality, but no, it doesn't have a consistent expectation, which is a little bit of a difficulty, right, TJ? Anytime you're trying to promote a wine in the public and you can't point to a box that it lives in that's narrow enough for the average consumer, it presents a difficulty selling the wine.
Yeah, I think with Pinot Blanc, definitely it depends on the region and their tradition with the grape, and then the producers, of course, because it's all over the map stylistically.
Yeah, and that has a lot to do with my next comment. Is yes, it's grown widely, New World, Old World, all over Europe, but no, it does not have one name. as is normally the case in Europe. It has a lot of names based on country and even region inside the country. But your most common ways to find it on a label are Pinot Blanc, Pinot Bianco, which is the dominant name in Italy, although you will also see it under Weissburgunder in Alto Adige, where they have Italian and German are both considered the primary languages. You will also see it as Weisser Burgunder, separated into two words in German regions. And then there are a bunch of other names, like, for instance, a region to watch out for Pinot Blanc is Slovenia, just across the Friulian border. And there they call it Bellipino. So all of those things could show up on a label, but they all are the same grape, Pinot Blanc. And, you know, plantings are concentrated in deeper pockets, so to speak, in Northeast Italy. And Italy definitely has the most Pinot Blanc planted. Alsace, Austria has a love of Pinot Blanc, of Weissburgunder, as they call it there, and for a couple of different applications. And then there's southern Germany. Baden and Pfalz particularly have a lot of emphasis on Pinot Bianco, Weissburgunder, Pinot Blanc, depending on who you're talking to and where they sit their winery. So let's go a little bit further and talk about this. You know, this picture here, if you're watching and not listening exclusively, is kind of the thing that I think you should be thinking about with Pinot Blanc. And that is that, yeah, there's variations on the theme, but they all tend to be in the same color scheme of fashion. Pinot Blanc is not a big, blousy, aromatic, powerful grape. It's a subtle, delicate, in the right hands, quite interesting, and can be intense in certain aspects, especially if you have like a Rebholz Grosses Gewächs, for instance, or Dr. I think it's Dr. Hager that I was thinking of out of Baden. When you have a wine like that, which is intense care taken and great vineyard site for Weissburgunder, then all of a sudden you have something with a lot more personality. But in general, the styles kind of are, the overall acidity is moderate plus in Europe and more close to moderate in the New World. The overall weight is medium bodied most of the time. There are a few examples like that get bigger than that. Usually they've had oak aging, or maybe they've got some other grape blended in alongside. Like there is a trend to blend Pinot Bianco and Chardonnay, but it was an actual, well, let's just stop there. In Alto Adige, for many, many decades, they didn't realize that Pinot Bianco and Chardonnay were different grapevines planted next to each other in the same vineyard. They just considered them different clones. And it wasn't until recently that when the Chardonnay AOC was created for Alto Adige that they had to delineate between the two grapes. And they are very closely similar, leaf structure, etc. And often the only way the vineyard managers know which one they're harvesting is to look at the clusters at veraison, because the Chardonnay turns gold and the Pinot Bianco stays green, and the Pinot Bianco is a much tighter bunch, and Chardonnay has more loose space between the grapes. So that's one of the interesting little factoids. And so because that was a tradition, now they're coming back to that and going, well, that made great wines in the past, so let's do that intentionally. And winemakers like Yerman, for instance, blend in Pinot Bianco with other grapes. It's also really great based on what I just told you, right? Not a huge personality, moderate plus acidity in Europe. It becomes a really important sparkling wine grape. Cremant d'Alsace leans on Pinot Blanc heavily, as do sparkling wines in Champagne method sparkling wines as well in Italy. Now, Austria is a different animal. They really like Weissburgunder. It's a huge player around Lake Neusiedl in Neusiedlersee, because that grape it attaches to botrytis really well. And those grapes around, those vineyards around that area, with their botrytis effect, they end up making wines that are sweet out of this. But there are also exceptional dry wines made, like by one of our producers. Heinrich makes one that's great out of Goals. And then TJ, you were mentioning one right before we went on broadcast that I needed to remember to mention from Austria as well.
Yeah, Weingut Rudi Pichler makes a fantastic Weissburgunder in the Wachau.
Right, which is an area that we normally only think of for Gruner Veltliner and Riesling, right? And it would make sense to me that I am going to assume that his Weissburgunder vineyard. Do you know which part of his ownership it is in? Because I would suspect it's in those deeper loess soils for its optimal, but maybe it's planted up on a rocky hillside.
Off the top of my head, I don't remember, but I do remember it being in a fairly prime site that you would think would be, normally devoted to, like you said, Riesling or Gruner, but Rudy really likes the grape and does a fantastic. Yeah, it's in the Kohlmutz, Rosendorfer Kohlmutz vineyard. So.
Oh, okay, cool. Which is and more lust driven, if I remember correctly, but could be wrong. And then there's the idea in Germany, Pfalz and Baden really, really love this grape for reasons that make sense there. Not so steep hillsides, richer soils in some places, and it's a warmer area of Germany, which gives them the ability to lean on Weissburgunder's acidity, and while they get it riper than other places would, so it makes it less simple. And that's where you'll find the great examples of like Reb Holtz, who makes definitely one of the targets. If you want to find out the potential of Weissburgunder in Germany, he's one of the targets to try his wine. Another really great producer that we sell here in the Mid-Atlantic for sure is Wittmann. Makes a Weissburgunder that's really outstanding out of Rheinhessen. And then Dr. Heger, Heger, is probably is definitely a star of the show down in Baden. And then we have our own in Alto Adige, which we'll talk about in just a second. In Alsace, it tends to be treated like an everyday white wine consumption wine in favor of Pinot Gris instead. It's not listed as one of the 4 noble varieties. If we remember our Alsace history, 4 varieties were given the ability to be made into the Grand Cru sites. And they are Riesling, Pinot Gris, Gewürztraminer, and Muscat. And all of those grapes are considered noble. So if you can make higher tiered wines out of Pinot Gris, it's kind of natural for them to kind of put Pinot Blanc on the back burner. But they make a lot of Cremant d'Alsace there out of it. And they blend it with Auxerrois on the regular and make very good everyday wines. And in the hands of a really good producer, these wines are quite charming and have this sort of spicy fattiness to them in their best case scenario.
I was going to ask you I don't know if it's the correct time to ask this because it requires some
Never
speculation.
a bad time for a question.
This requires a little speculation on your part, but I think you're up to the task. So Pinot Blanc, being a color mutation of Pinot Noir, originated somewhere in France, probably around the Burgundy area, right? And then in Alsace, it's often, not every producer, this is a generalization, but it's often treated as a workhorse grape, suitable for blending and generally not to be too serious. And then you go over to Italy and Alto Adige, it's definitely more respected and more elevated. And then you go to, as you mentioned, Germany and Austria, where they really treat it very seriously. So it seems backwards to me. It would seem the French would prize it the most. What do you think accounts for that sort of progression of isolating the grape and really elevating it to a noble status?
It's a good question. I think that sometimes it's probably a combination of things, right? By the time Pinot Blanc made it into Alsace, they were already well indoctrinated into their favorite grapes. They historically have allowed Pinot Blanc yields in Alsace to exceed their other 4 varietals. And so they never really saw its greatest potential unless they were being very intentional. So if you don't see great potential in the grape, you're not going to focus on it. And then once the law codified that it couldn't be as noble as the others, then there's no point, right? Now it's definitely got to be relegated. Whereas in in Germany, it's still about the majors, right? It's still about Riesling. It's still about that as their focal point. And then even when you get into faults, Pinot Noir is probably more respected than Weissburgunder. But as Germany and the younger set of drinkers starting in the basically this German nationals drink dry wine, including dry German wine, and the not so dry German wine and definitely not dry German wine tended to be exported more or drunk a little less over the years. And Weissburgunder became a very easy direct access wine because it's less intense than dry Riesling. Still a great food wine. It's still expressive of location. And I think that the winemakers themselves found a charm in making it. It gave them options perhaps that Riesling didn't give them. I think that's a factor. And then when you get into Italy, it fits into perfectly. It's a grape that fits perfectly with the traditional Italian view of white wine, which, and I don't, I'm going to say this with a big set of quotation marks, traditional view, or this is an overgeneralization, but in general, white wines in Italy have been crisp, refreshing, and cleansing, and not focused on being big and bold and rich, right? Even the Chardonnay coming out of Italy today is still more like cool climate, Chablis / not so oaky Burgundy than it is anything in the New World by norms. And I think Pinot Bianco fits perfectly into that idea of it blends well with food, it washes things away, and I think it suits their culture really well. So I think that's a really long answer to basically say it was culture.
Yeah, no, that's great. That was off the top of your head too. No, that was not a
Yeah,
prepared
we didn't talk
question.
about that in advance. So
That was a good answer.
I didn't think about it as I was reading it, when getting ready, because I spent more time on Pinot Bianco because that's a less known grape to our audience and our customers, researching and thinking about it. And I think anytime you deal with a grape that has, let's say, a lack of personality, that's going to appeal to specific people and be refused by others. But I think its lack of personality, without being mean to it, is actually a reason why it's such a great, awesome offering in restaurants and hospitality games, because of who we can approach with it. And we're going to get to that next. So in the New World, interestingly, Jancis Robinson, and I had a couple when I was visiting British Columbia that I thought were nice. She feels that British Columbia is doing a great job with Pinot Bianco or Pinot Blanc. And I would believe that. My own experience in Michigan, TJ, is that a couple of producers there were making world-class Pinot Blanc. One in particular is Left Foot Charlie, and his single vineyard that he touts highly, I stand behind 100% as being one of the most charming Pinot Blancs to try out there on the landscape of wine. And after that, then in California, it's sort of the first real efforts at it kind of treated it like Chardonnay. Chalon did that, where they put low yields on it and then put it in oak fermentation. And it was a little hard to tell apart from Chardonnay, which makes sense when they look a lot alike in the vineyard as well. But that was mainly because of the fermentation treatment. And there are examples now that are not oak aged out of the New World, but that was sort of the way it started for us here. So comparisons. To what shall this be compared? Pinot Blanc, Weissburgunder, and all of its iterations. One, you're going to have a variation in style. But let's go down the middle ground of Pinot Bianco. Weissburgunder is not noticeable oak, moderate plus acidity, a little spritzy texture, or zesty, I think, not spritzy, zesty texture where it feels like it's cleansing. Orchard fruits, apples, green apple, etc. And then in its most interesting forms to me, TJ, it gets this little smoky twinge in the flavor profile. And it could be from skin tannin. It could be just a natural flavor of the grape. Could be the yeast that people are choosing to use for Pinot Bianco, or maybe native yeast in certain places. But those are the charming aspects to me. And I'm okay with the idea that it's not broad and rich and crazy, because I think it puts it in a different category. So I kind of throw this wine in with, if you like unoaked whites, you're going to like Pinot Bianco Weissburgunder most of the time. So if you drink Pinot Grigio out of Italy, you're probably going to like Pinot Bianco. If you drink unoaked Chardonnays, meaning I like Chablis and I like lower intensity Chardonnays, you're probably going to like Pinot Bianco Weissburgunder. If you drink Italian white wine in general, you're probably going to like Pinot Bianco Weissburgunder, because it fits into their sort of mantra of how white wine should express itself. Any other comparisons you'd like to make that would help someone connect to this particular grape?
No, I I agree with what you said. I think when it's on the lighter side, it can have that nice floral, lemony character, and then as it gets, when you get into the Weissburgunders of like Rudy Pichler, very Burgundian in style and very much a Chardonnay like comparison, but yeah, it's definitely in that world. Not quite as aromatic as Pinot Gris, not quite as complex, and maybe not as neutral as Chardonnay. So it's, yeah, it's a very friendly grape that's capable of producing, as we've talked about, everyday workhorse, just delightful, easy drinking white wines to something more serious.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that Jancis Robinson said it's her go-to wine for a large group of people that aren't terribly wine focused, meaning they don't have a definitive thing they want to drink, is one of her favorite Alsace producers, Pinot Blanc. And I was like, I'm not exactly sure if that's a compliment or an insult, but it sort of categorized it as, this wine is likable by just about everybody. Which I thought was very interesting. So here's a couple of producers in addition to the Rudy Pichler wine we brought up. These are a little bit easier to find because the Pichler wine is not a huge production. And both of these, at least there's enough to find. So this is Tiefenbrunner Weissburgunder. Merus is the subtitle. And then Tramin or Cantina Tramin Moritz Pinot Bianco. And I admit that both of these wines show up in my house on a regular basis because I like them both very much. TJ, I think you looked these up to give people a retail approximation. Is that true?
Yeah, it's, as we've talked about in past webinars, it's very much an approximation, but the Tramine is around $15 wholesale, and the Tiefenbrunner is $2 or $3 more. Average retail. So, but take that with a little grain of salt, depending on what market you're in.
Yeah, they're both great wines. I find the Tramine to be just a bit more spicy. I think they use a little skin contact because it has a little bit of a tannin level to it, but they're both really, really nice. Both in oak-free closures, by the way. The Moritz is in an Eno-Lock stopper, the glass stopper, and the Tiefenbrunner uses a traditional twist off, and both worth your time to go find. So if you're in the audience, you haven't had these two wines, find them. Worth the effort. All right, let's move on to red wine. Garnacha, at home in the heat. Absolutely. This is such a Mediterranean grape varietal. There is some, all of my life up until last year, it was very clearly stated that Garnacha is the same grape as Grenache and a few other synonyms, and that it originated in Spain, most likely from somewhere near Campo de Borja region, and then traveled to other places from there, including the island of Sardinia during Spanish rule. Genetic research on Sardinia that's fairly compelling has started to lead people down a path that it possibly actually came from Sardinia and went to Spain and then either came back or there was clonal variation or something like that. And I found that very interesting. Although for now, I think we're going to live in the world that for now it still seems to be the most commonly held opinion that it originated in Spain. And you're going to find some interesting synonyms for it, even in Spain, but Grenache is the French term for it. Garnacha is the most common Spanish term for it, but you will also see it just listed as tinta, Tinto, Garnacho, and on Sardinia, it's called Canonau. And then another Spanish synonym is Tinta Aragonesa, because it originated in the region of Aragon, and so it was the red of Aragon. It's in character-wise, it's a thin-skinned red varietal, which surprises a lot of people because it can be a powerful wine and it can be fairly tannic in the right situation, but it is a thin-skinned, red fruited, mostly red berries, strawberries, that sort of thing. Until you get it really, really ripe, it's going to stay in that red fruit spectrum. It can achieve high levels of ripeness, and that's its great value in places like Rioja, where the extra alcohol brought to the table bolsters the lower alcohol Tempranillo and makes a more textured wine. It tends to be spiced, white pepper most commonly, herbal, herbs de Provence, rosemary, that sort of thing. And to be quite honest, a bit overlooked. When you think about how many people are like, I'll have a cab, I'll have a Pinot, I'll have a, what do people most often ask for in when they order red wine or buy red wine off the shelf? I would say that the quality and what is offered by Garnacha is overlooked. I think the grape is noble in the best hands, and almost always drinkable and a better value than a more popular grape at the same price range. Any disagreement with any of that, TJ, or you want to add to any of it?
No, I have a question about the tans, because Garnacha is a very funny grape because it can produce really fairly light, easy drinking reds to very, very serious reds, and with a lot of tannins. But the tannic structure is very different from something that like Cabernet Sauvignon. How would you explain the tannic, how the tannins come across in a Garnacha?
To me, tannin in Garnacha is a little bit more powdery to gritty, and Cabernet tannins are almost plating, like really covering, and they feel bigger, like they have a greater textural component. And then when you get into something like Nebbiolo, which is maybe the hardest tannin of all in wine, that's just a different animal altogether. So Garnacha doesn't lack tannin in any way. The bigger, bolder ones end up in that moderate plus tannin range. It's just a different approach. It's less obvious. And I think some of the reasons it's less obvious is that Garnacha generally produces a fairly fruit-driven wine, which covers up a lot of that tannin. And it doesn't make wines that are very acidic. And like in Nebbiolo, the acid level in the wine accentuates how you perceive the tannin. And so I think these moderate acidity, moderate plus at best, most of the time acidity wines that come from Garnacha tend to not promote the tannin level in your palate. And so you don't notice it as much. So I think that's my general take on it. And the other is production method, right? So those lighter, fruitier styles of Garnacha are often seeing whole cluster fermentation or whole berry mixed with some crushed berries to try and really extract fruit without tannin, so that you get into these easy drinking, friendly reds of the Southern Rhone, etc. And then the other thing is that most Garnacha doesn't see significant oak aging, and so you don't get that bolstering of oak tannin either. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay. Do you agree with?
I do agree with you.
All right. Well, all right. We have an achievement. We agree on something. It's awesome. All right. So Garnacha in general wants to have a fairly dry climate. It doesn't mind having winter, but it doesn't want killing cold. And it just loves dry, warm to just plain hot summer temperatures, as witnessed by, the highs in Campo de Borja approaching 100 degrees at times. The highs in the Rhone, regularly in the 90s, even if it cools off at night. And then its love of places like Barossa Valley in Australia. Also, even though Barossa is not as painfully hot as sometimes we think it is, because it cools off in the evening quite nicely, it still loves that McLaren Vale, Barossa, Mediterranean, warm, sunny, dry summers. And it will grow in a variety of vineyard styles, although its most common homes tend to be rocky, gravelly, well-drained locations. You won't see a lot of Garnacha with noticeable oak on it until you move into New World or until you move into newer styles where they're making really powerful Grenache or Garnacha, and they're putting it in some oak because it can take it, these high-powered examples, and it can work there. I think Garnacha, for me personally, and this is a personal opinion, not a dictation of quality or style, I like to see Garnacha with less oak because I really like to taste the herbal, spicy nature of Garnacha, Grenache, more than I like to taste the winemaking method. TJ, do you have a feeling on that?
Yeah, Garnacha can have some really interesting, mix of fruits too, red and blackberry fruits all in the same grape, which can be overshadowed when there's too much oak. And I have had some very powerfully oaked examples that are probably more intended for aging too. But my cellar never gets that old because I don't have the patience.
Exactly. Yeah, I buy wine to consume it, not to stare at it in the closet. I'm with you. It's often a little surprising to folks that when I meet them in public and they'll say, "So what's your wine cellar like?" And I'm like, "Don't have one. I have 5 children. there's no cellar." But nonetheless, we move on to comparisons. So, interestingly, in Barossa Valley, they used to actually call Grenache before they had to stop. They used to call it Pinot. It was Barossa Pinot because it's lighter and it's not as powerful as Shiraz, and it didn't make these deep inky colored wines. And so winemakers in Barossa loved it for that. It was a little lighter style that they could make and drink themselves, and it didn't, that sort of thing. It is often when you're not paying attention, you can miss Garnacha for Pinot Noir when you're tasting it blind because it is red fruited and it doesn't have hard tannins until you stop and start thinking about the structure of the wine doesn't quite fit Pinot Noir. But that being said, if you have somebody who loves West Coast US Pinot Noir, where they're regularly experiencing Pinot Noir with red and black fruits, with 14.5% alcohol, sometimes more, and oak aging, that's a pretty easy transition from that style of wine into a Spanish Garnacha. If you have someone who likes old world wines in general, you can move them into places like the Rhone with a little bit of ease. If they drink Italian wine, if they like Amarone and they like Brunello di Montalcino and they like, that sort of thing, the Sangiovese and Garnacha are not that far apart as far as style either. So you can move somebody from I like Tuscan wines into I like Southern Rhone wines fairly quickly. So those are some initial introductions, and then the rest of it is just food, right? Simple Côte de Rhone, for instance, works with just about everything on your menu. It becomes a chameleon because it's not usually 100% Grenache. It has other things in it, and that spicy lack of oak, not huge personality up front tends to blend well with a lot of different kinds of foods. Any other comparisons you'd like to throw in while I move to the examples to look for slide?
No, that sums it up. I wanted to mention, I think somebody told me this, or I dreamed it, in Australia, that the producers sort of divide into 2 camps: the ones that treat it like Shiraz and make it like that, and the ones that treat it like Pinot Noir and make it like that. And the latter is a growing category. There's a lot of really elegant examples coming up.
And I find that to be a fairly accurate generalization, because when it's left alone and not blended, it's not a Grenache Shiraz Mourvèdre blend, right? It's not a GSM out of McLaren Vale or Barossa or someplace, and it's just Grenache by itself. I did feel the same. I felt like there was a distinctive divide, and you were either on one hillside or the other. You were either making it big and powerful, or you were making it more like the one on the screen. The Yalumba Bushvine Grenache is light and elegant and refreshing, and I think that I think that one's a fabulous summer red because you can put it in, drink it at cellar temperature, like 58 to 60 degrees, and it's just plain refreshing. Whereas when we talk about Tres Picos on the other side, that wine is very ecumenical on the table as well, but a little more powerful, a little more darkly fruited, not quite as delicate. And then the Gigondas from Chateau de Saint-Côme is one of the world's most noble, I think, examples of Grenache. Really worth your time and effort. I find that to be you can drink red wine anytime if that's what your thing is, but I find that wine to scream for fall, flavors of the fall. And it's really great with like braised meats and stuff like that. So I think you have some retail data on these 3 wines.
Yeah, and just to mention the Bodegas Borsal, which just comes out of Tres Picos comes out of, and then they have their sister winery Alta Moncayo.
Yes.
I have never seen one area, or basically it's 2 producers, but it's very closely related producers. So it shows the whole spectrum of Garnacha, from really light, unoaked, strawberry-driven, fruit-forward, easy drinking, very inexpensive wines, right up through, definitely one of the most serious 100% Garnacha wines in the world from Alta Moncayo. It's fantastic. Yeah. The Tres Picos here on the left is, again, approximately about $15 retail. The
always been a good value.
Saint-Côme Gigondas around 38. And then the Yalumba Bushvine Grenache around 17. Again, those are just approximations, will depend on your market.
Yeah, I think you'd be hard pressed to spend a better $38 than that Gigondas.
Well, Louis Barol, I think everything he makes is fantastic, but he's rightly recognized as a Gigondas specialist. And one of the things that I was mistaken about, Ron, not too long ago, was that, Gigondas is really just a sort of a junior Chateauneuf du Pape, and it's really not. That's unfair. It's its own appellation. It's got its own style, and what Saint-Côme does is combine that power with elegance that I think is really tricky to do with Grenache, and I think the Gigondas has that both in the same wine. It's really fantastic.
Yeah, Gigondas has its uniqueness of sitting right behind that limestone mountain range that protects it from the north wind. It's not the galets soil that you see in the sand of Chateauneuf du Pape. It's this calcareous mix with a pretty decent elevation change. It's a very different place to grow Grenache, and the results are amazing. I've always loved Gigondas. I think it's pretty awesome stuff, and his is really good. But I will tell you that all of these wines, depending on who you are very pleasurable for the money, for sure. All right, we close today. And what I would mention is that we are going to skip one of my iterations. And so the October 5th date here for sparkling wine strategies is true. And TJ, I think this is a great timing for it. It was actually going to happen in September, and I think it's better that we talk about it in October as we start leading into the holidays, although most of my strategies are everyday strategies, because I believe that you can sell sparkling wine every day of the week all year long, if that's what you want to do, and that's what we're going to talk about.
So you're thinking some Halloween tie-ins here with sparkling wine?
Sparkling wine trick-or-treating. Yes, that's what I want when I show up to the door in a costume. Is yes, I'll give you a glass of champagne. That's fabulous.
That would be great. I would trick or treat every year. So you don't mean strategies of how to make it. We're not going to learn when you're winemaking. This is strategies of how to sell different sparkling wines.
Yeah, how to make sure that sparkling wine never goes bad in your hospitality facility.
Oh yes, well that's I
remember. And that
Yep.
You actually have the courage and confidence that you don't have to shy away from having more than one.
I worked at restaurants where if the wine wasn't available in splits, we wouldn't buy it because we were afraid of throwing away the bottle. So I could have used this seminar a long time ago.
Yeah, you weren't alone.
Too late for me. But
thankfully those days have passed, and most restaurants now offer something by the glass, but most of the time it's not what they could be doing. I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Well, that's a teaser for October 5th. At 11 a.m. Eastern time. Join us then. And of course, catch up with the Bordeaux show, which will be on its coming back next Tuesday. We'll be talking about the left bank classification from 1855. So Join us for that. And always catch up on our past pre-shifts and Bordeaux show webinars on our YouTube channel, Winebow YouTube. And we will see you hopefully here next week and then again on October 5th. Thank you very much and be safe.